How do you guys feel? Should we give it another minute? We've been at 18 for a little while now. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I know we've got a lot to cover here too.
Do it.
Okay.
So, are we on? Yes. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Good. All right. I'm glad we gave it a little time to let people trickle in. So with that, good evening, everyone, and welcome. And for those who've been waiting a couple of minutes, thank you for your patience, and thanks for making time in your evening to attend tonight's ReCode Forum. I'm Christine Grimando. I'm the Director of Planning and Urban Development. And I am joined this evening by two of my colleagues in the department, Nell Donaldson, Director of Special Projects, and Matt Grooms, Senior Planner, both part of the city's ReCode team. ReCode, some of you may have been following it. It's a multi-year initiative. It's where some big and pressing issues facing the city will be tools to address them will be implemented in sometimes quiet ways and subtle ways and in big ways too. And hearing people's thoughts and ideas at these forums is so important to shaping this project and ultimately shaping the city. This project's going to have an impact on the future of Portland for many years to come. So I'm really excited for tonight's forum. This is one of a number of different ways people can learn about and contribute to this project. And this one is going to be offer some variety in the way we've done some of these events, particularly remote events in the recent past. So I'm really looking forward to it. We're also joined here by our consultants, Chris Jeanette and Rista Strungus from Camiros, our ReCode consultants on the project. It has been wonderful to have them and their experience with Camiros working on progressive coding initiatives across the country on this project here in Portland, and they will be leading off our presentation tonight. Welcome to them as well. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Chris.
Thanks, Christine. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're on a bit of a schedule tonight. So thanks to everybody for joining us and for taking the time. Really happy to have you here, really happy to have this opportunity to get some feedback and talk to you about how you're feeling about some of these recommendations. So the way that we're set up tonight is to talk about the housing element, some of the housing recommendations within the land use code evaluation from about 6 to 6:40 with a 5-minute break. Then moving on to climate change from 6:45 to 7:25, again, another 5-minute break. And then wrapping things up with transportation. We're anticipating that people will be kind of dropping in and out of these sessions. So we're building in a little bit of a buffer for people to kind of get in, get settled as we switch topics here. So thank you all for being here at the beginning. Really appreciate your time. So with that said, let's get right on into it. This event is designed really to allow for you all, everyone who's here, to have a chance to provide feedback to us, ask questions, leave comments, and engage with us around the housing focused recommendations within the land use code evaluation. We've got some interactive tools lined up and some polls, as well as some free answer situations kind of geared up to make this more of a conversational event, hopefully. So with that, let's jump right on in. So we're using a tool here called Slido. This is going to enable you to participate in a variety of the events that we're going to have tonight. A couple ways for you to access this. So you can, if you're on your laptop or on your desktop computer, you can open up a browser window and sort of set it to the side here of the Zoom where you're looking at my presentation and go to slido.com. There you'll punch in that number, the 192604, and that'll bring you right into the event. Alternatively, and this is what I'd recommend for most people since it seems to be the easiest way, even if you are in front of your computer, if you've got a smartphone right next to you, just scan that QR code, hold it up to your camera. It should give you a little bit of a link. You click the thing and it'll take you there. Alternatively, you can just type slido.com into the browser on your smartphone as well. I don't think that we have anyone joining us that's just a phone number, so that's good because I can skip the instructions for if you're just joining us by phone for now. So curious to see how many folks have been able to join us. I'll just give us another minute or so for everybody to try and get themselves set up here on Slido so that we can do some of these cool interactive events. Okay. Hopefully that was enough time. You all can still be joining. Again, the code is 192604. I'm just going to go over a little bit about how this is going to work. So this is what the desktop version of the Slido app looks like. You can see it split up into a couple or a few different tabs here. The first one of those that's important is polls. So we've got some interactive polls as part of tonight's presentation. When one of those is triggered, you'll automatically find yourself on that screen with the ability to answer the question. There's also a Q&A tab. So this is where we're hoping to have a little bit of a dialogue with you all. So if you have a question at any point during the presentation, you can go ahead and type your question right into this box here. It looks exactly the same if you're doing it on your iPhone. And to note, your name is optional. We'd prefer if you're comfortable with giving us your name in case we need to follow up so that we could have that. But you can send questions through here, and we're going to work diligently throughout the course of the evening to be answering those to the best of our ability. We are a small team, but we're going to get to as many as we possibly can through that chat. Also want to note, it's possible as you're viewing the questions that have been asked to either give them a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So if you agree, you want to see the question answered, give it a thumbs up and it'll float to the top, and we'll make sure that we do our best to talk about it and get it answered. Alternatively, we are also going to have a live question and answer opportunity for you all to speak up, to unmute yourselves and talk to us. And that'll happen sort of at the end of each one of these sessions. If you would like to speak with us, please go ahead and in the actual Zoom window, you'll see that there's a little icon there called Q&A. And if you click on that, I see one person, Anne, has already entered some information in there. So just go ahead and enter your information in there, and we'll be sure to give you an opportunity to actually speak up after we've done the interactive portion of things. Okay. So you'll see that there's also an ideas tab in here. And this is just a place for you to leave any kind of ideas or comments that you have as the presentation is ongoing, things that aren't questions, but that you'd like to make sure that we receive. And again, those are able to be upvoted as well. So let's see if we're able to actually get this going. In one word, what's your favorite thing about living in Portland? It can be more than one word. We tried it out. It doesn't just limit you to one word. So feel free to enter 2 or 3. So a lot of people like the walkability, scale, small size, small city vibe. Those are all, again, very similar, right? Growth and vibrancy, location, history. It seems like walkability is pretty important to the people of Portland. As someone who lives in a walkable neighborhood, I absolutely agree. It's one of the key things. And as someone who's been to Portland plenty of times, it's one of my favorite things about the city. Immigrant communities, accessibility to nature. These are all really great. These are all, part of what makes Portland such a dynamic wonderful place to be and to live, right? And so these are the things that we want to make sure that we're acknowledging as we move forward through this process, that we're really building upon these strengths with whatever we're doing through the code work. So that was great. We got about 18 responses. So that's also a good number for us to know in terms of how many people we've got on here. All right, so moving on to something a little bit more substantive, just want to get a bead on how many people that are joining us tonight are familiar with the comprehensive plan and the land use code. So Portland's plan 2030, as well as the land use code. You know, either you're very familiar, you're using the land use code, or you maybe participated in the Portland's plan process. You're somewhat familiar, you know that they exist, but you haven't read them, or you're just unfamiliar and you have no idea what I'm talking about right now. So it looks like most people are very familiar, which is great. Nobody doesn't know what I'm talking about, which I don't know how you'd end up here if you didn't know what I was talking about, but it's good to know that we're bringing everybody along. So it's good. It's good to know that we all kind of know how these things work together. That said, for the folks that are somewhat unfamiliar, it's good that I've got a couple slides here really just kind of explaining what we're doing, right? So thinking about really the policy that's established through Portland's plan. This is what the city wants to evolve into over the planning horizon set to 2030, right? So these are the big aspirational things that the city wants to do. These are the goals for the city over that time period. The regulations are a set of rules, right? They're relatively static. They don't kind of change as often as something like the plan would change. So they have to work and they need to be flexible. In terms of housing policy, what we're talking about in terms of the stuff that's coming out of Portland's plan are a few key goals, right? So increasing, preserving, and modifying the supply of housing in the city. Making sure that anybody that works in Portland has the option, has the opportunity to live in Portland. Encouraging quality, sustainable design for new housing that gets built. And then encouraging additional density that's contextually appropriate to the city's neighborhoods. And that's located in areas that are close to neighborhood centers, services, transit. So those are some sort of larger policy goals, right? And so how do those reflect themselves when we start talking about regulations? Regulations deal with things like uses and use standards and parking and dimensional and design standards and landscape. And the code structure can even have an impact on whether or not some of these things are possible. So there's not exactly a one-to-one relationship. You can't really draw a line between one of these policies and just one section of the regulations. And so really what we're trying to do here is achieve this middle piece with the land use code evaluation, right? We're trying to draw those lines. They might be squiggly, they might split and branch in a few different places. But we're really trying to show a series of techniques and approaches that can move us from sort of those broader policy goals that are part of the city's comprehensive plan toward an updated set of regulations that can really work to be targeted ways that those goals are implemented through the regulations. And so what you're seeing here is kind of how they sit in the middle, right? So some of these related to housing might be expanding the range of permitted dwelling types or adjusting dimensional standards to encourage new residential development, rezoning certain residential areas, and adding clarity around certain types of housing uses. So I'm just going to go through some of the key recommendations that have come out of the land use code evaluation. The first one of those is expanding the range of permitted dwelling types. So currently there's both a little bit too much specificity and a little bit too much vagueness in terms of the types of dwelling units that are permitted within the code. There's a multiplex and a multifamily use, and then there's single family and a duplex, but there's really nothing in between. And so what we're proposing here is to pull out specific new types of dwellings that would be allowed within the code. The way that we have kind of drafted this up in the land use code evaluation is thinking specifically about 3-family dwellings and 4-family dwellings as new categories of housing. So what this allows us to do is to kind of pull those out of this basket that's considered multifamily and to think about where we might allow them to achieve a greater diversity of housing within the residential zones, right? So I think if we're talking about something like multifamily, that could be anywhere from, currently could be anywhere from 3 units up to 24 units. And then you separate out something that's specifically saying 3 units and 4 units. There's a little bit more tolerance for that in an existing neighborhood. It's a way to kind of gradually, incrementally build in density in a way that also respects the character of existing neighborhoods. So revising both the uses and densities within the lower density residential districts to allow up to 3 and 4 family dwellings is one of the key recommendations. Part and parcel with this is adjusting the dimensional standards to make sure that they're working to support housing in the residential zones. So looking at things like minimum lot sizes and densities, as well as setbacks that are required, particularly in zones like the R3, R4, and 5, where our analysis has indicated pretty low levels of conformance with current standards, right? I think the general picture is that what's built in a lot of these neighborhoods is not necessarily reflective of the zoning, that it likely came before the zoning. The zoning hasn't magically changed these neighborhoods into kind of a more suburban model, right? So how can we look at these existing standards and revise them to really match what's on the ground, match those traditional development patterns, and support the creation of additional housing within these neighborhoods? Simultaneously thinking about the impact of dimensional standards on the relationship of infill development to existing development within neighborhoods, making sure that even though we're considering allowing new types of dwelling in new areas of the city, that we want to do it in a sensitive way, so that we're making sure that, for instance, in zones like the R6, that any new development that's coming in is going to be compatible with what's already there, and making sure that we're thinking very carefully about where those things sit on the lot, how they orient both to the street and to existing development. Rezoning certain residential areas, particularly off-peninsula residential areas. So where, as I mentioned, R3, R4, R5, building patterns aren't really matching the existing zoning, there's an opportunity to amend those standards to achieve a higher degree of conformance. And in certain parts of the city, particularly lower density places like the R1 and the R3, what we're seeing is the possibility to maybe consolidate and rezone certain sections. There's a recommendation within the land use code evaluation to look at consolidating the R1 and the R2 districts, and simply using a 10,000 square foot standard for those areas, which would work to match the on-the-ground development pattern as it is now. So thinking about how these tools express themselves both within the actual regulations and then eventually the way that they express themselves on the ground throughout the community. Adjusting dimensional standards and uses to support housing in the city's mixed use zones. So we've talked a lot about the residential zones so far, but there's a lot of potential in the city's mixed use zones to accommodate additional housing as well. So what are we doing to make sure that that is able to be leveraged as development continues to occur? Well, one of the things, a specific recommendation here, there are others, is to eliminate, first of all, the on-peninsula and off-peninsula distinction that exists within some of these districts. And what this does is it says, for instance, if I'm on peninsula, I need only 400 square feet per dwelling unit. But if I'm off peninsula, I need 1,000 square feet per dwelling unit, despite the fact that this is the same district, the same intent, the same purpose statement, just two different areas of the community. So what we're suggesting is that that distinction is not needed. And then encouraging transit-oriented development along transit corridors. So allowing for density where it just makes sense in the city. Right. So thinking about transit supportive density, which is generally considered to be at least 8 units per acre. The city has adopted policy in One Climate Future that's really advocating for more along the lines of 20 units per acre, thinking about how that reflects in additional height permissions. And what we're doing in terms of creating this density, creating this opportunity for people to live closer to transportation, to not have a car, to want to be walking and biking more places. How are we also going to make sure that we're requiring and incentivizing pedestrian-oriented design elements and features along these corridors as well, to really facilitate the type of development and to make it comfortable for people to want to live in these areas? And then lastly, adding clarity around specific housing related uses. So this is kind of one thing in the code right now that's a little bit confusing, is there are some potentially overlapping categories of uses, things like sheltered care group homes, lodging houses, special needs independent dwelling units, or the SNIDU, and congregate care facilities. There's potential for some of these to be consolidated or maybe even eliminated if it's determined that they're not needed. What this really needs is a review to make sure that they're all serving a purpose and that they're all necessary to be included in the code moving forward. So with that said, curious to know where everyone who's with us stands on these recommendations. So what we're asking is for you to choose the 3 that you think are the most important. So how this works is 1, 2, 3, 3 clicks, your most important, your second most important, your third most important. And we should be able to get an idea up here of the kind of level of support just to people on our forum here tonight for these specific recommendations. And I'll give a little bit of time for this, since I know it's kind of a lot to take in, and it's a lot to choose just 3 of these options. I'm not seeing anyone voting. Okay, it says the poll isn't active.
Chris, I just activated the poll.
Okay.
It didn't seem to trigger for some reason.
Oh, okay. All right, so it should be active now. Thank you all for letting us know. Let's try. There we go. So it's working for at least one person. Here we go. It's starting to happen. Great. Interesting. Okay. So it looks like just among our group here that there's the most support for adjusting dimensional standards and uses to support more housing in mixed use zones, although it's pretty tight and it's gone back and forth a couple times with adjusting those standards to allow for more housing in residential zones. And they're all tied now. I keep speaking too soon. There's a problem with things that update automatically. Allowing greater diversity of housing types in residential zones, and then rezoning certain residential areas, especially off peninsula. And then it looks like really close after that between the next 2, which are adjustment of dimensional standards to support more housing in the residential zones, and encouraging transit-oriented development. So this is great feedback. I want to just kind of contrast that to what we've been seeing so far in the poll that we've got active on ReCode portland.com. So there have been almost 500 responses to the poll, Those aren't necessarily individuals completing every single section. As you know, if you've taken it, you can complete it in separate sections. And so what we have are a number of responses to sort of each policy area. And what we're looking at here are the levels of support for recommendations within the housing survey element. And so what you can see is that the lighter color indicates less support, all the way up to this darker color, which indicates more support on a scale of 1 to 5. So I think the overall picture is that it's looking so far, based on the results of our poll, even just during this forum, and what we're receiving so far through the survey online, that there's broad support for a number of these initiatives, which is really great. It's really great. Obviously, first and foremost, people seem to be interested in transit-oriented development. Some of the same ones that we're seeing here tonight, allowing greater diversity of housing types in the residential zones, and then adjusting the dimensional standards in both residential and mixed-use zones to make sure that what we're doing is actually allowing these things to be built. So that's great. And I think what you start to see as you start to look at some of these numbers as well, like for instance, 87 people that responded rated TOD development along transit corridors as their, as a 5, as very, very high support. 79 voted to allow greater diversity of housing types as their primary support. But also 15 people voted 1, right? So they don't really support allowing a greater diversity of housing types. It's important for us to see that even in areas where there is this broad support for all of these recommendations, right, that there are conversations happening in the community on both sides of these things. So it's important for us to know where those issues might be, so that as we're working to implement the city's policy, which is what we're doing, that we're, as we're working and we're creating and reviewing language, that we're really working hard to achieve the city's goals in a way that kind of brings along and gathers the support of as many residents as we can. So it's important for us to know where these conversations are happening. And I think that they're starting to reveal themselves in some of the materials that we're receiving back from folks. So this is great. So want to just open it up. If there's anything that you all think that we've left out, just any kind of quick ideas. I know that, there were a lot of sort of recommendations that we made in the report, and there are some that we've made that we've talked about here already. If anyone has ideas and you want to share them sort of with the group, you can type them into this poll here. Obviously, there's also the ability to type them in on the ideas tab or to email us at any time through the links on ReCode Portland. Just going to pause here really quickly to see if there's anybody that wants to share anything. And then I want to keep moving because I want to make sure that we have enough time to get to some questions and answers. So reconsider parking minimums. Right, making them lower. Okay, that's the clarification that I was hoping for. I was hoping for a clarification, I should say. These are good. Wonderful. Switching to a more form-based code, removing use considerations. Thinking about more density on large parcels off peninsula. Okay, this is great. I would encourage you all to keep entering these in on the ideas tab as well, so that we can make sure we've captured them in the record. They'll show up here, but also want to make sure we're capturing anything there that didn't get a chance to get entered. Okay, so we have got some questions that have come in through the Q&A portal. And at this point, I think what we had talked about was, Matt, potentially opening it up to you to talk about maybe these top 3 questions here. Unless, have you had a chance to star any of the questions? Yes.
I did. So we started a couple of them, and we right. So we've started a few of these to talk through here in person. There's some more that are there as well, and I'll just open it up to the rest of our team as well to walk through these and talk to them.
So the first one here looks like got 5 votes, so good job. 4+ unit buildings exist in low to medium density residential zones that fit in terms of size, style, height, massing, and context. Why deny this history with the 4-unit limit? That's a good observation. So, I mean, if there are areas of the city where we've kind of underestimated what sort of density is acceptable, if there are, 5, 6, 7-unit buildings, and that's a form that we need to think about including separate from something like a multifamily. Maybe we need an individual category. It's good. That's good to know. I don't think that we're trying to deny the history. I think that what we're trying to do is really to acknowledge and reinforce the history. So if that stuff is there, it's good for us to know about it. Will form-based code be expanded? I don't think at this time there are any plans to expand the form-based code. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, but I'm speaking for myself and not for staff.
The only thing I'll add to that, Chris, if I could jump in, is I don't think we've viewed this necessarily as a let's expand the form-based code that we have in terms of applying it to the whole city as the paradigm. But I certainly think the form-based code we have and form-based codes out in the world have informed some of our thinking in terms of graphics and legibility and the need to simplify uses and emphasis on performance standards and other good things form-based code, I think, highlights. But at this point, it's not sort of a pure pursuit of a form-based code by any means. But certainly if there are best practices to be gleaned from form-based codes, we're happy to use them.
Yeah, excellent. Sorry, and I might have misinterpreted thinking about that. That was referencing the form-based code, but yeah, certainly I think we're always looking for the right tool for the job, and if form-based controls are the right tool for the job, we're definitely open to pulling some of those in where we need them. So we've got a couple others here. Has the city taken a position on the state's Housing Commission recommendations, which could mandate certain land uses like multifamily dwellings?
I'll also jump in on that one. I participated in and followed closely the State Housing Commission process and was part of a municipal working group that contributed to that. And there was there were broad contributions from across the state that fed into those recommendations. And so the city certainly had some involvement in that. And I think support for a lot of what was in there. Those recommendations are still being studied for what's going to be implemented coming out of that study process. So I think there's still a critical window of what out of that commission process and those recommendations are actually going to sort of move forward for potential changes for communities. We'll know more a little farther on in 2022, and there will be more opportunities for the city and for the individuals to contribute to those specifics in the near future.
Great, thanks, Christine. So the last one here is, has the city considered rezoning for home ownership, as in multifamily development that would allow residents to purchase their homes for affordable prices? Does anybody on our team have any insight into what this might be?
Yeah. I'd say, Nell, you've jumped in too.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is an interesting question. We haven't gotten this question before. One thing I would say is our policies so far, with the exception of some of our affordable housing policies, don't really address home ownership versus home rental as a goal or as a distinction, in terms of uses or priorities. Certainly diversity of housing types and opportunities for potential opportunities for homeownership would be a goal, but so is secure and affordable rental housing. And so as far as the code goes, there's not a distinction in there from a zoning perspective to privilege home ownership over something else. But that might be one of the outcomes of robust housing policy, that there are more opportunities for that too.
Absolutely.
And I would just add that I
Yeah,
think
and
rezoning for.
I mean, as a general rule for everybody, zoning stays away. Zoning essentially does not care who owns what or who rents what. It's pretty neutral in terms of home ownership. So, you know, there are zoning tools that can encourage this type of thing. I think that there may be other sort of mechanisms to get closer to what Hillary here might be talking about, but they would be likely outside of the land use code. Okay. So with that, I think that we have, I want to make sure that we have enough time to let some folks speak up. So if you've asked a question in the chat, we're going to do our best to make sure that we can answer it and publish it following the forum here. So Nell has been looking at the Q&A on the actual webinar, and I hope that maybe some people have put questions in or their names that would like to speak up.
Yeah, there are certainly some questions that have been asked there, and I just want to reassure people that the questions that have been asked through the Q&A in Zoom, we're capturing in conjunction with the questions that have been asked through Slido, and we'll do our best to answer those. If we can't tonight, we'll try our best to answer them after this is over. I see one hand raised for a question, a live question, and it's been up for a while. So I'm going to unmute you to allow you to talk, to ask your question, and we'll try to answer it. If other folks would like to raise their hands and get in queue to ask a live question right now, this is the time to do it. And you can do that again by raising your hand. So Anne, you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask your question.
Okay, it's me, Ann Pringle of the West End, and I was actually going to make a comment, but I think you're looking for questions at this point, so I'll guess I'll hold my comment for some other forum.
Either way, yeah, go for it.
I did post, you can see my comment, if the staff is familiar with this, about looking at the Munjoy Hill experience before you change densities and setbacks, dimensional standards. So I think there's a big lesson there that has to be understood before you go forward anywhere else in the city. Thank you.
Thanks, Ann.
Yeah, that's a great, so Anne had asked a question about the impact of increasing density and height and changing other dimensional standards in residential zones, and how that might affect property values and the potential for affordable housing, which are great questions to ask, and things we're thinking about as we think about how we might change dimensional standards and uses and rezone parts of the city. Tim, I see your hand up, and Zach, I think your hand up was up as well, but it went down. So I'm going to go Tim, and then Zach, and then Michael LeBlanc. Tim, you should be good to talk if you unmute yourself.
I just had to unmute myself, yes. Yeah, I hope we don't take the wrong lessons from what happened on Munjoy Hill, which I think Ann just suggested. And that would be horrific for the city. We have to think about the environment. We have to think about how people want to live. And there's been no problem on Munjoy Hill, except for a few loud people who obviously don't care about the environment and don't care about affordable housing, don't care whether we're a transit oriented or a walkable city. And it's sickening. It's unfortunate. We need more density. And there's less people living in each house. It's just a fact, right? And I hope that we take it into consideration of what needs to happen, and we need to do it well. We need to build nice buildings. We need to build buildings that are going to last for hundreds of years. That's what we need to focus on. But we need more density, and we have to be realistic about some of the demographic trends that are changing, and about keeping our world sustainable and fighting climate change. It's really, really important. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. All right, I'm going to go to Zach next. Zach Borowitz, you should be able to unmute yourself. Zach, I'm asking you. Okay, good. Zach, can you go now?
Yeah. Okay.
good.
Thanks. Thanks again for putting this on. this time on the record. I've commented a few times anonymously. You can try to figure out which ones are mine. It shouldn't be too hard. I have a sort of very specific question, maybe too specific, but I'll go with it anyway. I think it said something about standardizing setbacks, and is that actually a recommendation? To my mind, standardizing setbacks would be the wrong approach, as the closer it is to the curb, the smaller the height you would have. Then the further away from the curb, the higher you could go, kind of a form-based approach to setbacks. So I want to make sure that that's actually what you're proposing. I'd also like to make the point that I said a couple of times in the document that Portland is growing. And I'll say for the record that Portland is not growing, hasn't grown in 50 years. It's been the population has been the same. And in terms of national growth and county growth, Portland's effectively shrinking. So I'd like to make that clarification. But getting back to the setbacks.
Yep.
But
Thanks for both pieces of that question. To kind of tackle the first one, I don't think that we've recommended looking at standardizing setbacks. So what we're advocating here is looking at the patterns of development as built in some of the city's neighborhoods and figuring out if the setbacks work, right? So, I mean, if the setback is saying your house needs to be 15 feet from the back of the sidewalk, and most houses along a block are 10 feet or less from the back of the sidewalk, then maybe that zoning district doesn't have the right setback, and maybe we need to think about reducing it. So really sort of reinforcing the patterns, which will vary across the city. It's not going to be a 10-foot setback everywhere. It might not be a 10-foot setback everywhere. Or anywhere. I'm just spitballing with a number here. The other thing I think that we're open to and that we've suggested is looking at contextual standards where those make sense, right? So I've got one house that's 20 feet back. I've got another one that's 10. Maybe mine can come in at 15. So standards that respond for both sort of newer infill development that allow that to occur in a way that kind of makes sense with what's already happening in a neighborhood, but that really kind of reinforce the good things about a neighborhood and reestablish that rhythm, that pattern that people want to see. People don't want to see necessarily one house 5 feet back, the next house 50 feet back, the next one 15. So really thinking about reinforcing that pattern through the standards instead. I think you guys, maybe we should take one more question and then move on to the next topic. I want to make sure we're staying on time.
Yep. So we have Michael LeBlanc is in the queue, and I think you should be able to.
Yep, I am muted. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great, thanks. So I had one question. I apologize, I missed the first couple minutes of this, but so if I'm re-asking a question that's already been asked, I apologize. But has the city, or is the city considering density bonuses for building to say passive house standards or other sustainable or really meaningful sustainable design practices? So for instance, like in the R6 zone, where I believe the acreage is 735 feet per unit, that might begin to change a little bit if someone's meeting passive house standards or something like that.
Yeah, so one of the recommendations in the report is to take a look at bonuses. So whether they're additional height, additional density, related to some other site development standard, whatever they may be, that one of the options to actually achieve those bonuses would be sustainable construction. So we don't know if that's necessarily passive house, but it's some sort of high performance construction, net zero, LEED. Green globes is another one. There are a lot of them out there. So I think we take the comment. We're definitely looking at sustainable construction as something that would potentially achieve you a bonus.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I think maybe we should just move along. We had planned on taking a 5-minute break here, but we just blazed right through it. So let's go ahead and keep going. All right. So I think that there might be some people that have just joined us, it looks like our attendance grew a little bit. So thanks to everybody for joining us. We're really happy that you're here. If you've been here the entire time, I apologize. You're going to have to listen to me go through a little bit of the same stuff that you've already heard so that we can get everybody up to speed. So again, super happy to have everybody here. We're really excited to get your feedback. This event tonight is designed to allow you to ask questions, to kind of give us some interactive feedback, things that we're curious about, and to leave us comments and let us know what you think about the climate change recommendations that are within the land use code evaluation. So we're using a tool that's called Slido for a bunch of the interactive content, polls, questions and answers, and the ability to submit ideas. And if you are on your computer, you can open up a browser window, move it to the side of this Zoom presentation, type in slido.com, and then you enter this code, which is 192604, and it's going to pull you right into our presentation here. And so you'll have access to all of the interactive content. You can also do this on your phone, which I think is actually the best way to do it. So if you're sitting in front of your computer, but you've got your smartphone with you, go ahead and scan this QR code, and it'll take you right to the Slido event. If you don't know how to scan a QR code, which I have to admit, I didn't know how to scan the QR code until I had to do it for this, then you can just open a browser on your phone and go to slido.com and enter the code the same way. And this should work to allow you to join and to start contributing to the poll. So I'm going to give about 30 to 45 more seconds for people to see if they can get themselves logged into the Slido, and then we'll move on to the very next slide. Okay. So hopefully we've got a lot of people coming along with this. So this is what you'll see when you open up the event on your computer. On your phone, it looks very similar. You'll see this first tab here is polls. This is where the interactive polls will show up. When we activate those, give you the opportunity to give us some feedback there. There's also a Q&A tab. We would encourage you to ask your questions here if anything comes up during the presentation portion of things. If you've got any questions that you want to ask us not related to the presentation portion of things, stick them in here. We would prefer if you could give us your name in case we need to follow up so that we know who to talk to. However, you can go ahead and submit questions anonymously there as well. I've also highlighted where you can give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to any questions that you see. Our tendency is to want to answer the ones that float up to the top. So if you like a question and you want to hear the answer to it tonight, then go ahead and give it a thumbs up. We are also taking questions or the opportunity to ask live questions tonight. If you actually stick your name in on the Q&A little window, that's actually part of the Zoom webinar presentation. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see a little thing down there that says Q&A. It's going to have a little red 2 on top of it. You click there. Please just go ahead and put your name in there if you'd rather talk to ask your question, and then we'll know to call on you and give you the opportunity to unmute. And that will happen kind of toward the end of our session here. There's also an ideas tab for you to just leave us a comment or an idea. Please note that you're limited to 300 characters. So if you want to submit a really long idea, email is probably a better option. And you can always submit anything, questions, comments, ideas to us through the contact information on the ReCode website. So to see how many people we've got live with us on Slido, just a little icebreaker question. Curious how long most of you have lived in Portland? Okay, so we got 24 people that answered. Looks like we got a lot of lifers, which is great. People move to Portland, and I think that they don't move away, which is one thing that we've learned. That's a great place to live. Although it looks like we've got kind of a nice little breakdown here. People from everywhere from over 20 years to less than 3 years. So it's great to have representation from a bunch of different viewpoints with us here tonight. Okay. If you've already answered this question, I'm going to prevail upon you to answer it again so that we have kind of a more accurate understanding now that we've got some people who have joined us. Just your level of familiarity with the comprehensive plan and the land use code. Have you used it? Have you read it? Either or both of them? Do you not really know what they are? Have you skimmed them? And, you know, be honest. It's okay if you haven't. Great. Again, it looks like most folks who are responding are at least somewhat familiar. So this is good. And we've got very familiar kind of moving up too. So good. We've got a good base level of understanding here, but we also have some folks that are somewhat unfamiliar. So bear with me if you're one of the people who've been with us from the beginning and you are familiar. Now might be a good time to get up and get a drink of water, because I'm going to talk about policy versus regulations again. So what Portland's Plan 2030 really does is it establishes the policies for the city moving forward over the planning horizon for the plan, 2030, right? So these are the big policy goals. This is the vision for the city moving forward. What the regulations are kind of the ABCDE tools to get us from where we are now to where we want to be in the future. So when we're talking about climate change, some of the policy goals that are coming out of the city's plan are things like developing climate resilience, right? Thinking about carbon reduction goals, comprehensive climate adaptation strategies, and making sure that we're building and developing in a way that's protecting the city's most vulnerable infrastructure. Adopting sustainable land use and transportation policies, pretty self-explanatory there. Supporting agricultural, forest, and scenic resources, both within the city and in the region, and then making energy efficiency and renewable energy measures a citywide priority. And then finally, identifying and protecting Portland's critical natural resources, right? So these are the things we want to see happen. It's not really possible to draw a line from any one of those sort of very admirable policy goals to something like a bullet point that says zones, right? It doesn't really seem to connect very well because what the regulations do is they force us to think in a very sort of rigid way about how things are going to be implemented. So what we really need here is what the land use code evaluation is intended to provide, which is the bridge. It allows us to kind of translate the policy to the regulations through a filter of techniques and approaches. So here's what this might look like for something like climate change, right? So if a policy is to develop climate resilience, one of those techniques and approaches might be to plan for less intensive growth in areas that have high flood risk and support more intensive growth in areas with no or low flood risk. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, don't worry about reading all of these here because I'm going to go through them one by one. As I do that, I'm going to actually get up and let my dog in the room because she really very much wants to come in. So the first one of those is revising dimensional standards and uses in the context of risk and resilience. So thinking about those areas of the city where it makes sense to see growth in the future, where, you know, things are going to be less at risk. If we want to be building new housing in Portland, do we want to be building new housing that's going to last 100 years, or do we want to be building new housing that's going to last 20 years? And then, you know, planning for less intensive growth in areas that are at risk. So if there are flood prone areas within the city, how are we going to adjust development standards so that we're not seeing as much development within those types of areas? We're prioritizing resilient areas to accommodate new growth. Encouraging transit-oriented mixed-use development along transit corridors. the context of climate change, this just makes sense. You know, allowing additional transit supportive densities, as I mentioned before, generally considered to be at least 8 units per acre. Additional height requiring pedestrian amenities to really encourage people to want to locate in these areas where they can not have a car, where they can walk to get groceries, walk to get coffee, walk to dinner, hop on a train or a bus to get to work. It's a lifestyle that people are really wanting to see during the future, and it's a lower carbon, climate friendly lifestyle. So making sure that that's an option for folks in Portland if that's something that they're interested in. Allowing a greater diversity of housing types within residential zones. You know, this is kind of another thing that we talked about in terms of the housing policy section. So revising the permitted uses and densities within some of the lower density residential zones, allowing for new housing types in there, whether it's 3-family, 4-family, 5, 6, 7, multifamily. This can be a more efficient way to live, right? There are built-in efficiencies in terms of energy usage and carbon reduction with these types of dwellings sometimes, just as well as, you know, encouraging the kind of density that encourages retail and transit to occur within closer proximity to neighborhoods. Regulating impervious surface in all of the residential zones. So right now, the R6 is the only one that contains any kind of control like this. And it's actually an inverse of the impervious surface control. So it's requiring a minimum of open space or permeable area. And what we're suggesting is that impervious surface should be regulated throughout all of the residential zones. This is, you know, a really easy way to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to be reducing stormwater runoff, erosion, sedimentation in the rivers in the area. And it's kind of an easy way to make sure that we're controlling the impacts of new development as it comes in with respect to stormwater. So one of the things is allowing for a little bit of flexibility. So if we're putting into place impervious surface maximums in zones that allow for higher density, are we also building in flexibility for things like alternate tools like green roofs to accommodate some of that stormwater? Are we going to count that as impervious, or are we going to let that count? Revising standards to support solar installations. So the city already allows, I think, for a couple different types of solar installations for building mounted and then standalone ground mounted. The recommendations that we're making are basically just to see if there are opportunities to streamline the process for how these are allowed. We know that there's some work going on at the state level in terms of finalizing and adopting the stretch code. And one of the recommendations in here is that as that process wraps up and the stretch code is adopted, that another review might take place just to make sure that there's nothing kind of getting in the way or standing in conflict with what might be in the stretch code relative to solar installations. Thinking about bonuses to encourage sustainable construction. So this is, if you were at the end of the last session, we had a question about bonuses to encourage sustainable construction. So this is one of the things that we're thinking about. Are you allowed more height, more density, reduced setback, you know, various sort of other bonus items if you achieve high performance construction? So it could be something like net zero or passive house, or even LEED certification or green globes. There are sort of positives and negatives for each of these. And so we're going to be kind of determining the best path forward. It may be one path or it may be multiple. Revising the definition of agriculture to make sure that it includes urban agricultural activities. So right now, agriculture is defined as one thing, and it's allowed in basically the lowest density residential districts. Seems like a missed opportunity to incorporate some of the more modern forms, more urban forms of agriculture, you know, market gardens, vertical gardens, indoor gardening, thinking about different definitions of agriculture that could be added, or simply adding a bunch of new facets to the existing definition of agriculture to make sure that we're allowing for more modern activities to occur throughout the city. Strengthening natural resource protections is a key part of this as well. Sort of a suite of recommendations within the land use code evaluation that are focused on the strengthening of natural resource protections, from wetlands to coastal areas, coastal resources, stream and shore buffers, making sure that the city's regulations are aligned with the state, and that anywhere that they can be bolstered, that we're working to do that. And then prioritizing the development of green infrastructure. So we kind of talked about this a little bit with the impervious surface control. So we want to make sure that we're prioritizing the use of not gray infrastructural techniques to deal with things like stormwater, but that we're integrating low impact development standards, and we're really encouraging people to deal with the impacts of their sites through green tools and not gray tools. And providing flexibility for eco innovation. So as we're putting new requirements in for things like impervious surface, excuse me, are we also making sure that we're being flexible enough so that new technologies and techniques can be incorporated and included within those standards? So if I've got a shading structure or a green roof or a green wall or a solar canopy, making sure that that's not going to conflict with any of the other requirements of the ordinance, and that we've got flexibilities to let people put to use technologies as they emerge. And then consolidating and updating the landscape standards. So basically pulling all of the landscape standards that are within varying parts of the land use code at the moment into one new unified set of standards, which would include preservation standards, landscaping, and also street trees. And these would vary by zone as appropriate to kind of meet the character of the zone. But the idea is that they would be in one unified place so that they send one unified message. It's one place to go. They would prioritize native species, the benefits to habitat, wildlife habitat and habitat creation, as well as things like planting for pollinators. So that was a lot of recommendations. I think the climate change section has the most recommendations, but what we're looking for here is basically for you to tell us what you think the top 3 most important ones are. So we're going to give everybody about a minute here because I know you'll probably all need to read through the list and make this decision. But we want you to click 1, 2, 3 in terms of order of importance, please, if you would. I think maybe this is the one that didn't activate last time. Arista.
I got you already. It's active.
Thank you. Here we go. Okay, we're up to 20. It looks like the top at this point is encouraging TOD, transit-oriented mixed-use development. It's an important recommendation. Supporting more intensive growth in areas with no or low flood risk. So the idea of kind of resiliency-based zoning, allowing those portions of the city that are the most resilient or the least likely to experience the impacts of climate change to accommodate a little bit more development. And then considering bonuses to encourage sustainable construction seem to be the top 3. Although planning for less intensive growth in areas of high risk seems to be kind of coming up. So it's interesting. It looks like we've got a couple of clear winners in supporting more intensive growth in areas with no or low flood risk and encouraging TOD. And then everything else is pretty close, which is also good to see. So just to contrast this, and thanks to everybody for voting, with the levels of support that we're seeing among the folks that have filled out the survey on the ReCode website. are available through the ReCode website. So what you're looking at here in terms of the shades of blue are people responding on a scale of 1 to 5 to indicate their level of support for a given recommendation or initiative, right? So the lighter blue color, the lightest blue here represents someone that answered 1 to this question. The darkest blue represents someone that answered 5, or the highest amount of support. So again, kind of similar to the housing recommendations, you can see the overall picture here is broad support. The majority of each of these categories, the majority of respondents answered that they are 5 in terms of support. So that's good for us to see. Again, we do see that there are some areas where there's a little bit more of a conversation happening. We can identify that those may be the consideration of bonuses to encourage sustainable construction. It seems to be 11 people only support that at a level of 1. And there's a little bit more mixed support as you look through. And then maybe regulating impervious surface maximums in all residential zones. So there are conversations happening, which are good for us to know. Again, as we're working to implement these policy goals, we need to know kind of who's on what side and what we need to be acknowledging as we're going through and drafting to make sure that we're gathering as much support as we can for what we're going to move forward. Okay. So happy always to ask if you think there's anything we've left out. So, we've presented a lot of recommendations here related to climate change and things that we can do with updating the city's land use code. If there are any that you think we've left out, tools or techniques specifically related to the land use code, changes that we can make during this process that you think will help to update the city's climate change goals, we're really happy to hear those. You can type them in here through this poll, or you can add them in the ideas comment, or you can actually even email them to us later. If you type them in here, give us an idea to give us an opportunity to kind of see what's come through and talk about it a little bit before we move on. Okay, so hoping we're getting some ideas, maybe input through the ideas tab. There we go. Require new projects to submit carbon impact analysis. Okay. Good to know. All right, so here is the fun part where I open it back up. See if Matt has any insight in terms of the questions that we've been getting so far.
All right. Yes, so the first question that we have here, and these are all questions that we'd received through the Slido question feature, is, has the city considered using the Dutch technique of the polder, dikes and pumps or sluices to make the city more resilient against sea level rise? I don't know if any of my team here has any thoughts on that. It's a specific question.
I don't think the city is there yet. I mean, certainly Dutch examples are inspirational to all of us, but I don't think there are these sorts of solutions on the table for Portland at the moment. Who knows what the future may hold, but not currently.
Yeah, I would just add to that. So the way that we're thinking about this through the land use code, right, is about not only sort of site level resilience, but also how to plan for use and form and sort of intensity of development in places that make sense, given that we know some of this is just we're not going to be able to deal with it through engineering. It's just going to happen. Sea level rise, right, and more frequent storm events, et cetera.
And then this next question is actually, it's somewhat related. And I know that we provided, there was a response in the chat that we provided, but thought it was worth flagging here as well, is this question about development that's happening close to or adjacent to the water's edge. There are a couple examples here that are listed. And I know one thought or one thing that we've identified in the code evaluation is that there needs to be further evaluation of coastal resiliency and what that means and what type of development is appropriate. And one thought that we have, or that we're pursuing, is this idea of a coastal resiliency overlay and having some type of, factoring in, certain development standards that would enable development to be more successful and to be more resilient in the face of rising sea levels. It's something that will require further study, and we identify that in the code evaluation, but it's certainly something that we're aware of. And then this third one here is, does the city have a plan to encourage intensive greenhouse hydroponic facilities to grow food year round? The city has actually actively worked on a community agriculture plan, or has participated in the development of a community agriculture plan. This is something that we are looking to achieve through updates to both the land use code as well as the city's technical manual to provide additional resources for folks who are looking to do edible plantings here in the city, and to encourage the use of edible plantings as part of development landscaping and in public open spaces, and it's something that is something that's being considered as well.
Yeah, and I would also say, Chris mentioned our sort of definition of agriculture and where agriculture is allowed, where urban agriculture is allowed here. The definition of agriculture in the existing code is pretty rural sounding, and it doesn't sort of acknowledge that there's ways to grow food in an urban environment that can be compatible with an urban environment. And so that's something we are looking at through the code evaluation, and we'll be looking at moving forward.
Great. All right, and then it looks like the last one here is more of a comment than a question. That all new building projects should be required to submit energy impact analysis. So I'm not sure that this is something that we've thought about as a component of this work, separate from the idea of basically allowing a bonus for buildings that meet certain energy goals and design goals. I don't know if anybody at the city has thoughts about requiring all new projects to submit energy impact analysis, if there's been any thinking on this.
It's an interesting idea, but one of my thoughts is that generally, and we haven't heard this suggestion sort of framed this way for the code that we're talking about right now, but certainly in terms of building construction energy requirements, that's something that's generally caught at the construction at building permit level, and the city has just increased its energy requirements and energy code standards for new construction. So just in terms of that sort of flow of what comes through for, say, an overall site development to that stage where an applicant submits for a building permit, generally that energy analysis and those tests are coming at the permit stage, which is why they generally don't live in the code we're discussing tonight. There are other sort of ways you could go with the idea of energy impact in terms of land use patterns and car use and things like that. That would certainly sort of warrant thinking about what would that look like early in the application process, but something for us to chew on, I think.
Great. All right, I want to make sure we have enough time. If anybody has entered their name into the Q&A, to go ahead and talk to us.
Great. So I have a couple of hands raised in the attendee list here. If you'd like to share a question live right now, this would be the time to do it. You can do so by raising your hand and I will try to get to you. The first name I have here is Eamon Dundon. And Eamon, you should be able to unmute now.
Yeah, thank you, Nell. Just really quick, I think, if we're thinking about a coastal overlay zone, which I think is a great idea to encourage resiliency in these areas. I think a big part of that would be prohibiting sort of uses that are most vulnerable to sea level rise, like residential, I think of primarily, from being on the first couple floors of buildings. So you'd think instead you'd want commercial, retail type uses or parking on the first couple floors. So if we are going to make that requirement, I think we'd also have to marry that with certain height bonuses in those zones to allow for the current level of intensity that we have in the code right now. So I would just raise that. I think it's a great idea for us to consider, but there's sort of a yin and a yang to that where we have to build up if we're trying to avoid people's housing from being flooded, for instance. So that's the only thing I would raise. It's not really a question, but overall, I think it's a great idea for a city like Portland that we know is going to be uniquely impacted by sea level rise. Thank you.
Thanks, Eamon. The next person I have is Carol Walker Ayton or Ayton. I apologize if I said your last name wrong, and you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Thanks. Yeah, it's Ayton. Good
Ayton.
job. I married it. That wasn't my last name. So we moved to Portland 10 years ago and did a lot of research around where to live. And we ended up in the West End and used sea level rise maps actually to inform our purchase. So the West End felt kind of high and dry and safe, and we're good to go until we're too old to be here. But as the city develops, there's so much development happening in areas that I just think, like the Children's Museum, and I asked the question around Thompson's Point and the Rue Institute, all really cool, wonderful organizations that are right there on the water. And I have a background in nonprofit management, and I don't really understand the risk that these organizations are taking in investing incredible amounts of money in physical locations that seem really sketchy from a sea level rise perspective. And so part of me is, yes, the city has informed them that's not a great idea, but at what point do you create policies that say it's not a good idea, it's actually a bad idea, and we won't allow you to do it? And so, where is that line, I guess? Where's that line? And I think it's a huge issue for Portland, and it's a peninsula, it's got the cove. I mean, there's just so many places that you shouldn't do that. That's a bad investment.
That is a great question. It's a fundamental question moving forward, right? And I think that, Matt alluded earlier to us sort of looking at coastal resiliency overlay, so zoning for these areas that we know are going to be inundated. And we recognize it needs a lot more work, right? There's a large public process that needs to happen around changing permitted uses in areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise, or to looking at dimensional standards in areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise. And so so that work, we're thinking about how to make a commitment to that work, of sort of solid commitment in terms of time and energy and money to that work. And expect some of that work to come out of this process, but more to come for sure.
Okay, well, I run Leadership Portland, and we're meeting at GMRI in April for our Economic Development Day, and we're doing it specifically on the waterfront because I want everybody to be sort of right there to say, like, hello, this is your these are your livelihoods, and by the way, this is not going well, and what's your plan B? And I feel like the city is not taking an aggressive enough proactive stance on a very obvious, we need to do plan B. And I just think that ReCode Portland needs to put this plan B way higher up on the list.
Thanks
My
for the
editorial for the day.
Yeah, thanks for the input. All right, our next comment, or our next person who'd like to ask a question, I think, is Alan Armstrong. Alan, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
There I can. Thank you. Now,
Welcome.
as a homeowner who's had permission to install solar panels on my roof, limited, not fully denied, but limited, I just wonder if there's something that the ReCode could do to ensure that building owners have a right to mount solar panels on their roof, even if they live in historic districts.
Thank you for that. I think looking at that as far as what are the review standards, the question of right versus other tests for it, I think that's really valuable feedback to have. And the answer is we can certainly include considerations like that in this process. And I think that's valuable to hear. And I think that can be looked at as far as what balance are we striking with alternative energy and solar and other things, and how hard is it to do? So thanks.
All right, Chris, do we have time for a couple more? We have 2 more people with their hands raised. I think we have a time at least for 1 or 2 more. So Zach Borowitz again, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
All right, thanks again. I
Sure.
asked a question about curtailing automobile usage, because as I understand it, that's a large driver of negative climate change. And the answer was, well, that's in the housing. But considering that this would be kind of a triple bottom line issue, not quadruple, housing, climate change, economic development, what have you, would you consider kind of some metric where you count that as double rather than putting it in one box and not another?
I answered your question, Zach, and I'll totally answer this one as well. I think there's a lot of these recommendations that actually cross over these categories, right? There are multiple recommendations that hit on a lot of broader objectives of the city, and you're commenting on sort of density and transportation goals and climate goals all being aligned. And absolutely, I think where we can make our housing goals do double duty on transportation outcomes and climate outcomes, we want to make sure we're pursuing those recommendations in a really as sort of concerted a way as possible. All right, I think next on our list is Maggie Wolfe, and Maggie, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yes, hi, I'm Maggie Wolfe. I live on 28 St. Lawrence Street. I guess you didn't ask for that, but I'm so used to doing that little check-in. I totally agree with what Carol Walker said a few minutes ago. I know that the city, the planning department has been really gung-ho on this coastal resiliency overlay. But I think Carol's absolutely right. We should go the other direction and not give bonuses, but actually prohibit development in these low-lying areas. I came here to Portland almost 10 years ago now, but I lived for that almost 30 years before that in New Orleans, including during Hurricane Katrina. And it doesn't do you any good to put your housing starting on the 3rd floor if the area is completely flooded, unless you have some major kind of boat evacuation available to get people out of those upper floors. So that's just an excuse to give coastal developers more height, if you ask me, and I think it's very irresponsible. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Are there any other folks who'd like to ask a question live here? Feel free to raise your hand. Okay.
All right. So that being the case, I think let's go ahead and just take our quick 5-minute break. And then we can all come back to start the transportation session in about 5 minutes. Good job, everybody. You've been going for a little while. Get up, get a drink of water. Come back, we'll have some more fun. Okay. We're about ready to get started on our last session here. Thanks everybody for hanging in. Okay. So I'm not sure if we have anybody who has just joined us or if everybody's been here for the last session as well. Just want to, if you're just arriving, I want to welcome you. If you've been here the whole time, I want to say thanks for staying. This event is really designed for you all to have an opportunity to provide feedback to us, to ask some questions, and to learn more about the various aspects of the land use code evaluation. What we're talking about now is the transportation focused recommendations. So if you haven't already joined, go ahead, please, and join us at slido.com. You can do this on your computer. If you've joined us from a laptop, all you have to do is open up your browser, move it up beside the Zoom presentation, go to slido.com and type in that code, and you'll be automatically connected in with our event here. I would recommend using your smartphone if you've got one, even if you're on your computer. That way you can kind of have a dual screen sort of experience, and we've all found it's a little bit easier to interact using our phones. If you just have your phone, you can also do the same thing. You just need to kind of multitask away from the Zoom presentation and plug that information in at slido.com. So just give a couple seconds. My sense is that most people have been here, but I didn't have every name memorized, so I want to make sure that we're being accommodating. Okay. So this is what it's going to look like when you log in to the event in Slido. It will look very similar to this if you are doing it from your phone or from your computer. All of the active polls that we're hoping to get your input on will appear under the polls tab. There is also a question and answer tab. And this is where we're hoping that we can get folks to be engaging with us and asking us questions as the presentation's rolling on here. We're a small team, but we're going to do our best to make sure that we can respond to as many of these as possible. We would encourage, if you feel comfortable doing it, to please provide your name as you put your question, and that way we know who to follow up with if follow-up is required, but also note that you can do it anonymously if that's more comfortable. Questions can be voted up or voted down. The ones that float up to the top are most likely to be seen and answered during our presentation here, although we will make a commitment to make sure that we're trying to get to all of them. Additionally, there's an ideas tab. So ideas and comments can be left here, anything up to 300 characters. If you want to leave us a longer idea, please go ahead and submit it on the ReCode website. There are contact resources there that provide a variety of opportunities for you to get in touch. Also, if you'd rather ask a question by raising your hand and unmuting, there will be a section of the presentation for that as we're wrapping up. So you can either raise your hand on the fly, or you can stick in the Q&A of the Zoom webinar that you're interested in talking, and we'll track it through there. So just to make sure everybody's still joining us on Slido and that the people who have just joined us are able to also vote in the polls. Just curious where everybody's joining us from. I know we're all working at home now. I thought most people would be on their couch. No, most people are in their home office. This should have been a question about how many people are currently wearing pajamas, but yep. Okay. Great. All right. So it looks like it's working. We're all in our home offices too, so that's wonderful. I think Nell might actually be at a table somewhere, but okay. Good to see that it's still working. Again, just this sort of baseline question that we're hoping to get here. Apologies if you've already answered this. Please go ahead and answer it again. Just want to know the level of familiarity and just kind of keep checking in with us as we know our audience has changed as we've moved on here tonight. So it looks like we're still at least somewhat familiar in the majority. Which is good. Okay. So in terms of transportation and Portland's plan and Portland's land use code, what we're really trying to do is to bridge the gap here between policy and regulations. So Portland's policy as it relates to certain transportation elements is really to promote multimodal accessibility, to enable residents and visitors of all ages to participate fully in the community and to get around in a way that is useful and efficient for them, to support livability by improving quality of life in neighborhoods, as well as the public health of residents by providing a variety of opportunities for them to get around and to exercise and explore their town, and supporting sustainability by reducing things like energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, reducing vehicle miles traveled, thinking about stormwater impacts, and supporting economic vitality by ensuring that people and goods are able to move efficiently through the city in a variety of ways. So how do we connect the dots between those types of policy goals and the types of regulatory categories that we're looking here on the right-hand side? Obviously, you know, more than one of these categories is going to be touched by these goals, but it's not necessarily a very easy one-to-one relationship. So what the goal of the land use code evaluation really was to sit in the middle and bridge that gap and sort of serve as the connector between things that are within Portland's Plan 2030 and things that we can do as we update the regulations to implement them and to try and make that as clear as possible for folks to understand as we get underway here. So some of the techniques and approaches that we can use to implement those policies are things like encouraging TOD along transit corridors, enhancing things like transportation demand management, establishing parking maximums where they make sense. I'm just going to go through pretty quickly the list here of some key recommendations from the land use code evaluation. The first one being making sure that we're encouraging TOD. I think this is the third time that TOD has appeared. It has appeared in every category, so TOD is important. This is clearly one of those things that's going to span multiple categories, right? Because it has an impact on the ability for the city to build housing. It has an impact on the ability for people to have access to goods and services really close to where they walk, minimizing the impacts of climate change. And it obviously has an impact on transportation in the community too. So allowing additional density, transit supportive density. One climate future says up to 20 units would be a good goal to hit along transit corridors. And then supporting that environment, that pedestrian environment, by doing things like requiring pedestrian-oriented design features to occur at the ground floor. Making sure that we're consistently addressing the design of off-street parking, whether it's surface or structured. So currently it's handled both by use and by district. So if it's, you know, structured parking associated with a particular use in a particular district, it might have different standards. And what we're advocating for really is consistent standards when parking is a principal use. So including basic dimensional standards, how far back from the back of sidewalk it has to be, design standards in terms of what it needs to look like and how it needs to be designed. And then also thinking about off-site parking permissions where those might make sense. Thinking about enhancing the TDM requirements. So TDM requirements can work to shift trips, excuse me, to and from new development, from cars to other modes of transportation if they're done right. So things like public transportation, walking and biking, these types of considerations come into the TDM review process. So in terms of thinking about modifying that process, both internally and then also sort of setting the threshold in terms of where it would apply, there's some thinking going on about perhaps allowing or requiring TDM for projects other than the really large scale 50,000 square foot or more types of commercial and mixed use and institutional developments. One of the recommendations was to address autonomous vehicles. And this kind of spans autonomous vehicles to also include things like the sharing economy and pickup, drop off, Uber Eats, all of these things that, you know, a lot of people use, but we don't really think about their impacts on our built environment. But they are having impacts on our built environment. So thinking about adding standards for things like drop off pickup zones, flexibilities related to parking spaces and structure design. If vehicles are going to be parking themselves, do they need as much room? Those types of considerations, as well as staging, support and recharging that could work both for autonomous vehicles and for other types of electric vehicles. And then establishing parking maximums in locations that are close to transit. So we know that parking minimums are no longer required within a quarter mile of transit, but do we want to start thinking about establishing parking maximums in locations proximate to transit? One of the recommendations is to explore methodologies for where those types of, for what those maximums might be and where those types of maximums would exactly apply. And then refining bicycle parking requirements. So currently bicycle parking requirements are tied to the number of vehicular spaces that are provided. So for every X number of vehicular spaces that you have to provide a parking space for your bicycle. That approach obviously is not necessarily going to work anymore because a good chunk of the city no longer requires vehicular parking spaces. So moving to a standard that is based upon the square footage of a use rather than how much vehicular parking is provided is something that's going to have to happen. And then an additional recommendation is to start specifying how many of those spaces we want to be short-term versus how many of them need to be long-term. So if I live in a multifamily building or if I've got some sort of an institutional use, maybe a higher percentage of those spaces are required to be long-term, covered, lockers, those types of amenities to really make them useful for the people who are using them. So which of these transportation recommendations do you think are the most important? Asking you guys to pick your top 3 in order, please. Transit-oriented development, the perennial favorite. Looks like people are still voting at a hefty pace, so I'm gonna give about 20 more seconds. Okay. Looks like our top 3 are encouraging TOD along transit corridors, establishing parking maximums in areas proximate to transit, and making sure that we're consistently addressing the design of off-street parking. Followed pretty closely by enhancing TDM requirements and then refining bicycle requirements as well. So contrasting these with what we have heard so far in the responses to the transportation survey element that's available through the ReCode Portland website. You can see again, generally broad support for all of these recommendations. There is one outlier, which is the autonomous vehicles recommendation, which there seems to be some sort of mixed reactions to. And interesting to kind of hear the conversation that's going on around with that as well. But very similar sort of pattern in terms of priorities for people. So encouraging transit-oriented development, establishing parking maximums, and beefing up TDM and bicycle parking. It seems like in our group here tonight that the design of off-street parking was a little bit more of a priority. But generally, all of these seem to be very well supported recommendations. I didn't explain this time because I was assuming everyone was here, but if you weren't here for the last one, these charts represent the levels of support that people have expressed as they filled out the surveys on recodeportland.com. So with the lightest color blue indicating a level of 1 and with the darkest indicating a level of 4. So with regards to the city's transportation goals, I want to give an opportunity here for folks to kind of speak up if they think that there are any kind of tools that we have not considered, like a new mode of transit. So if you have any ideas, please feel free to go ahead and punch them in on the Slido poll. It's an open answer question. You can also leave any ideas or comments if you go to the ideas and comments tab up at the top. Or you can email them to us if you've got ideas as well. So public support for a zip car type of car share. Oh, okay, a bunch just came in. So things like flying cars, the Hyperloop and micro rail, those are, I guess, our new modes of transportation for sure. Zip car type of solution. Okay. Some of these are good ideas. So moving on, and if you have more ideas, also just want to encourage you, you can keep leaving them in there and add them to the comments and ideas tab as well. We'll be sure to take a look at all of them. So it looks like we've got some questions that have come in. Let's go ahead and start working through some of these. I don't know if anybody on our team has answered any of these and wants to talk about them. All right, Ken. Okay, so it looks like the first one here, as we move forward with improving our bus service, transit corridors may change. Yep. Are they currently the most efficient possible? I can't speak to the efficiency of the bus corridors necessarily. I know that there are a number of transit agencies, and as we're thinking of coordinating, obviously thinking about development rights and development potential where it makes the most sense, obviously we need to accept that that might change. And so, you know, in the future and moving forward, I think close coordination is going to be needed to ensure that where investment is going is actually going to be where the transit ends up.
Yeah, and Chris, I'm sorry, I was in another pane looking at something
Okay?
at questions, and so I was slow to get back to this this screen, but yeah, you know, for any of you who are plugged into the sort of transportation planning network in this region, there's active transportation planning happening around transit service in the region right now. A lot of time and energy being put into this, including looking at routes, at the types of services that are being provided and where. And so we are certainly keyed into those processes and are thinking about how those decisions relate to the land use decisions that we're making and the land use decisions, honestly, that are being made region-wide as well.
Great. So the second one here says there are a lot of surface parking lots top of the port and on the peninsula, in addition to lots for stores. How do you plan to encourage more intensive use? So that's an interesting question. And there are ways to get at encouraging redevelopment of surface parking lots. I'm not sure if we necessarily need to have that conversation tonight. I think we can take that question into consideration. You know, as part of the land use code, essentially one of the tools would be to not allow over parking within certain areas into the future, right? If we're thinking about things like surface parking maximums in areas that are proximate to transit, we're thinking about trying to prevent you know, the phenomenon of too much parking. I'm not sure if anybody on staff wants to talk about if there's anything else going on policy-wise to think about tackling the problem of too many surface parking lots?
Sure. I think even right now, I would say there's not sort of a tool to mandate they go away in their current form, but there's lots in the code that would encourage other uses to occur and even right now before we make changes. So if there's some examples, top of the old port, for example, the zoning does not say it should be a surface parking lot. It currently is. The current owners still find that a viable use. Certainly if someone wanted to do something, not to pick on that one in particular, on that lot or any number of other ones, there are lots of certain options, certainly on the peninsula, for other kinds of uses. I think when things change over in terms of ownership or new development ideas, those are those critical moments to really try to steer those lots into something else. And of course, parking requirements are a component of that, of how much and how we ask for parking to provide it, or how much we allow parking to be provided. But I would say for current existing surface lots, it's a question of when is there kind of an impetus for change, and when there is, will the code kind of steer that change in a better direction. I think there's some tools in place now, and I think at the end of the process we're in currently in ReCode, there should be even more to kind of strengthen that to encourage other kinds of uses, because I think we agree it's not always the best use of this dense center of the city land, or what should be dense center of the city land, instead of surface parking.
Yeah, and to dovetail on that too, to elucidate a little bit more on what Christine was just talking about. I mean, there's not a lot really through the land use code and through zoning that we can do to make things go away. We can set the table, we can provide a series of new opportunities, but we always need to keep in mind that zoning doesn't necessarily immediately make things go away, and it doesn't necessarily immediately make things happen. What it does is it can remove barriers, and it kind of plays a long game, right? So there might be other market factors that are allowing for those for the proliferation of surface parking lots in a specific part of town to continue and to be viable right now, but there may come a shift when that is no longer the case, and then zoning can step in and provide options for redevelopment should that occur. Okay, I think we maybe have time to answer some additional questions. I don't know if anybody wants to tackle any of these ones that are up on screen here, if we should provide enough time to make sure we're seeing if anyone has their hands raised.
I think we could probably do both of those pretty quickly, Chris. So banning surface parking lots over a certain size, we sort of just spoke a little bit to the ways that you might get to sort of controlling for parking when it's built in the city, right? We've talked about looking at maximums. We've also talked about design of parking, right? And so how is parking designed? Where is it located? How close to the street is it, et cetera, or sort of back, sort of alternative ways to get it. Questions of the actual space occupied by parking. Also, Chris talked earlier about impervious surface maximums, another way to sort of get it sort of large surface parking areas, et cetera. And then the last one about the Main Rail Transit Coalition. We're aware of a lot of work that's being done in this space right now around rail connections to neighboring communities, and there's an active study right now around rapid transit through the Gorham, Westbrook to Portland corridor, and so all of those efforts to increase transit access in the region, improve access to transit for folks throughout the region are represent good work that we're following and engaged in as much as we can be.
Great. Thanks, Mel.
So, yeah.
All right.
So there, yeah, go for it, Chris.
I was going to throw it to you.
All right, perfect. We've obviously done this before. So now we just took questions through Slido, but if folks want to ask questions sort of to speak up and ask questions live right now, this is the time to do it. I see Tim Wells has already raised his hand. If others have questions and they'd like to raise their hand, you can use the raise hand function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So while people are finding that, I am going to unmute you or allow you to talk, Tim, and you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Thank you. I was just wondering how the city sort of looks. I mean, there's this fine dance that you play with the zoning in that for certain, like what prompted me is thinking about all the surface parking lots, and you rezone them and allow more to be built. Will the people that own those properties be more induced to sell, or will they be more induced to do something themselves, so there, I mean, again, spot zoning has its place in some ways, because it allows people to buy, it allows people to buy properties that have a vision, and still, for instance, for affordable housing, and still keep it at a decent rate. And so it's a real fine dance around how you go about upzoning. So I was wondering how you guys look at that. I don't think in residential, I mean, I think, earlier there was a question of, well, what happened on Munjoy Hill raised prices, but that's because we just have so much demand for people who want to live in Portland right now. That's what's driving that. But as there are a lot of surface parking lot that could be used for a lot of different things. And how do you induce a change, but also do it in a way that, in general, the people that own land make the most money. It's not the developer, it's the person that owns the land. And people don't realize that. But it is a real fine dance to figure out the right sort of calculus, the right timing and everything for this. And I just wondered if you could elucidate any on that.
And you're sort of acknowledging or raising the point that zoning isn't the only variable in this equation, right? There are lots of variables in the sort of economic calculus that anybody is doing around their property. And I know Christine wants to say something, but I would just say, Tim, I think generally when we're thinking about rezoning or we're thinking about changing dimensional standards or uses, the idea is to sort of, to implement the plan, right? There are places that we've identified as sort of ready for additional intensity in terms of housing development or growth, and those were laid out in the comprehensive plan. And so, a good part of the strategy, or the sort of main strategy, is about making that plan a reality. And so that's where we're taking a lot of, or most of our cues from, as sort of required by state statute, et cetera. But Christine, you may want to speak more to the sort of like specific instance to which Tim is mentioning.
I think you covered it. No, I think I was going to more ask for a clarifier. Was the question about spot zoning, was that having to do with, say, a surface lot? Does it need extra inducement? And I'm not sure if that's what that was going at. Does it need something to sort of, or another use we don't like? Is there some other tool to kind of really prompt or induce a change? I think that rather than say, call something a spot zone and isolate individual parcels or try and anticipate all those things, I think it's really hard to anticipate exactly what is this sweet spot to kind of spur just the change you want. But I think part of this exercise is to not have to do spot zones if we're going to go, or not have to sort of do individual parcels by individual parcels, but to do this holistic look about, are we asking for, requiring, inducing the right things? I'm not saying cities and markets and property are complex. I'm not saying that will just ever be statically done, but I think what we're trying to do here is try to call some of those questions now rather than have to respond later, parcel by parcel to individual needs. So
Thank
more
you.
to come on that.
I agree with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Ken Capron, you have your hand up and you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yeah, Ken Capron from Forest Avenue. I'm the one who's been commenting about microrail all this time, and I'm still looking for an explanation from the city of Portland as to why they're willing to talk about it. But people should know that it's coming, and there's already 3 towns that are committing to it, and I'm sure the city isn't aware of that yet. But it's an alternative, and I don't know why the city isn't being vocal about it, letting people know that it's out there and that if encouraged, it could make a big difference. Both Nell and the name leaves me right now, but have been very adamant about not talking further about it and exploring it. I suspect they think it's very expensive when in fact it's probably the least expensive mode of transportation. But anyway, they've been kind of keeping it from people and not explaining the benefits and advantages and the costs. The fact is it solves all of the problems that have been mentioned about transit tonight, including the climate and energy solutions and passenger comfort, ability to get on and off wherever you want. There's no stations. There's a lot of other benefits for it, but the city doesn't want you folks to know about it. So I'm going to let you know about it. If you have questions, we'll be doing a virtual meeting probably within the next month. I don't know why the city hasn't allowed it to come forward, but they've certainly done everything they can to block it. And I wonder what else they're blocking that you don't get to know about. I'd be very interested in that.
Thank you, Ken. I would just say, I think we're interested in all kinds of transit solutions, and sort of whatever makes the most sense in terms of better transit, serving the people of Portland. We're interested in hearing about. And obviously, there is a cost factor associated with transportation investment, but like I mentioned before, we're involved in a number of studies to sort of figure out what modes are the best options for the region moving forward. Are there other folks who would like to ask questions? You can do so by raising your hand at the bottom of the Zoom screen.
Now, while we're waiting to see if there are any others, I just want to say, there are some written questions that have come in we haven't gotten to. This has been fairly dynamic, and there are different places people have been able to enter questions, and this may have been said already, but I just want to emphasize we'll respond whatever we don't get to tonight. We will respond or didn't get a chance to speak to directly or didn't come in as a live question during the Q&A we just did. We will respond to after as best we can and make sure answers and responses are available.
Okay. It doesn't look like there are any more questions. So just want to thank everybody for coming. We really appreciate your time. We really appreciate the feedback. We would encourage you, if you haven't already registered, to join us again tomorrow night. We're doing the same thing with 3 different topics: complete neighborhoods starting at 6, the built environment starting at 6:45, and economic development starting at 7:30. So if you want to attend those, please just go register again with the link on the website if you haven't done so already. Again, a whole variety of resources on the website, which I'm sure most of you are already aware of. If you haven't taken the survey, please take the survey and let us know what you think. So hopefully we will see everyone again tomorrow evening. Thanks again for your time. Have a great night.
Thanks all for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Night.